What's up, Howie? I think I'm gonna finally start doing the YouTube stuff now, so I'm just gonna get into it. Today I'm talking about a game that I like. It's called Pillars of Eternity. Uh, it's alright, but at first glance it might seem a little dated. But given what it's trying to pull off, I think it does itself justice. And if you're unaware, the Pillars of Eternity games are spiritual successors of a game series called Baldur's Gate. Now, I haven't played the first two Baldur's Gate games, so I won't be making a ton of comparisons there, but I've played a lot of Baldur's Gate 3, and I even did a honor mode playthrough with a couple of my buddies. But Baldur's Gate 3 is not Pillars of Eternity. Mechanically, they couldn't be more different. To get things started, I consider Pillars of Eternity 1 to be my personal favorite game of all time. When I first started my playthrough, I hadn't played any other CRPGs, and it was pretty brutal. I had no clue what I was doing, and I died a shit ton. But the challenge of learning that new system definitely carried it for me. And at the time, I was kind of just looking for a new game, and I just bought a super shitty computer that couldn't really run much. So one day when I was just scrolling through Steam, I came across a game that looked kind of interesting. I'm a huge fan of RPG games, and have played a ton of them, from Skyrim, Knights of the Republic, Dragon Age, Fallout, but I wasn't into D&D yet, so as far as immersiveness, I really thought Skyrim was peak and that it couldn't get much better. So I'm not going to get into any spoiler territory, because I'd love to convince someone to play this game. But I will give a brief history on the game's lore. Basically, a handful of years prior to the events of the game, some dude popped up and starts fighting with everyone. And he starts a religious war because he's claiming to be a god that the people worship. But a lot of the people don't like that because they don't see him as maybe he is the reincarnation of this god. So they just start beefing with each other, and they kill him in a super cool way, and you flesh that out as you do the story and hear more about that. But whether or not he was actually the god that he claimed to be, whether or not you'll find out by playing. But following his death, a huge curse is put on the land, and everything sucks for everybody. And then when your character comes in, you're just some dude or girl dude that gets caught and mixed up while traveling with a caravan, and you wind up getting your soul goofed with. This has huge consequences for your character because you start having these visions, and long story short, if you don't fix it, you will eventually go crazy. To me, this is already a pretty good hook because Pillars instantly throws some pretty scary consequences your way. Immediately, the story is about you just trying to find a way to survive in a super fleshed out world filled with scary shit and an in-depth history that someone smarter than me could probably write a book about. And Pillars has the kind of world building that I really like. It's a classic Obsidian style of force-feeding you info but not overwhelming you. It's in-depth but not too hard to understand, and it makes me, and maybe just me, want to dig in a little bit deeper, and allows me to do so at my own pace. In my opinion, too many RPGs require some huge effort to get immersed. It's either I read every book I find, or I sit for hours in dialogue, and if I skip anything, I'm completely lost. And that's what I love about Skyrim, that's what I love about Fallout New Vegas, I love that about Baldur's Gate 3 too, but I don't want to have to read every little item description. I mean, I love Elden Ring and its lore, but if you don't watch an hour-long video about some dude that read item descriptions, you're not going to have any idea what's going on, even though Elden Ring lore is super interesting. Now, I might be a smooth-brained Bethesda baby, but I like being told what's going on. But that does break that show don't tell rule, and that can mess with the pacing of things in a lot of games. In my opinion, not very many games have a good balance of telling you the important, interesting stuff, and having little bits of knowledge sprinkled throughout that will be there for you to ingest at your own pace. I think Baldur's Gate 3 does a great job of this. For example, I don't have to give a fuck who the alchemist was in the first Goblin Village, but if I want to get into his secret vault, then I gotta read his journal so I can guess the password for his magic mirror. That's cool, that's interesting. I don't have to care about who he is, I don't have to care about what he did. If I want to get into his secret room, then I'm gonna have to skim his journal. and I read his journal and I find out, okay, he's an evil necromancer from back in the day. Suddenly, I care, I'm interested, and I'm reading more journals. That's the kind of pacing that I enjoy. You've almost got to trick me into it, but once I'm hooked, and I'm reading everything. Back to Pillars, I think that it handles its pacing as close to perfectly as a game can. Others can disagree, but my opinion's the only one that matters. While I'm talking about pacing, the story that unfolds as you go from place to place, learning about the world and its people, it's filled with plot twists that are insanely well written and interactive dialogue that makes you actually care about the random NPC you're doing a side quest for. Now, I still remember most of the side quests I did, and I haven't done a playthrough in a good while. People are actually interesting, the kids aren't chodes, and the chodes have interesting backstories that I can sympathize with. I actually feel for the tyrannical lord who's driven crazy by a bunch of stillborn children, and he doesn't seem like such an asshole. He's a dude ridden with grief, hanging innocent people. Maybe he is an asshole, but my point is that the villains aren't cartoony and lame. They're people on the brink of their sanity, just doing bad shit to try to make their misery a little less miserable. On the subject of characters, the companions or followers or whatever you want to call them, I'm a big fan of well-written companions, but to me not a lot of games get it right. Baldur's Gate 3, Knights of the Old Republic, and Fallout New Vegas do a great job, but Skyrim, one of my favorite games, has admittedly some of the worst companions in RPGs. They're more or less just pack mules sworn to carry my balls or whatever Lydia says. But I think that Pillars does it right though. Each of the companions, even the ones that I ignore, feel like they have an important place in the world, whether it be the veteran soldier who's having doubts about what side he fought in the war, or the deranged priest who's questioning his goddess and her mission for him. I don't have much to say about the soundtrack or general sound design. The music definitely carries some of the more intense moments, but with the amount of games with stellar soundtracks, I just have a hard time putting it on a scale. On top of that, I'm just not really the type of guy to talk about scores or sound design. I love the music, but that's about it. As far as combat, the game is just hard, especially if you're like me and just used to button mashing fighting games until things work. But like I said earlier, it's a CRPG, which you don't see a lot of nowadays. And CRPG means computer RPG, and this style of game was made for PCs back when PC gaming was different, to say the least. I was born recently, so the games I grew up on were mostly on console, whether it's on Wiimotes or an Xbox 360 controller. Controls were simple and mechanics were more action-oriented. The experience of playing my first CRPG, not including KOTOR since I played that on console with an Xbox controller, was a major change up from my typical trigger my way through a dungeon experience. It sucked, but it was learnable, and it helps that Pillars is a CRPG by design, and not just because all RPGs are CRPGs, like it was back in 1990 BC. The mechanics were rough and strategy-oriented, and rewarded taking things slow, with just a couple enemies at a time and using choke points to secure an advantage. And at that point, I wasn't really used to that. I was used to just grinding for the best stats so I could walk in and mow everything down. And that worked for just a couple zones. Before Pillars, I didn't have to worry about where I positioned my magic users, because their fireballs could just lay waste to anything that gets close. But with like friendly fire and how squishy wizards are, it became clear that I'd have to get smart or I'd be stuck dying to some douchebag bear or bandit that's running at my party with asshole intent. The combat system is called Real-Time with Pause. It's essentially turn-based combat, but without turns, and that doesn't mean that everything happens at once. There's still an initiative system like Baldur's Gate 3, but it's more similar to older Final Fantasy games or Dragon Age 1 or 2 if you've played them. You and your teammates and your enemies will attack based on a handful of things like armor weight, weapon weight, and your class, just to name a few. There's a lot more nuance to it with armor penetration and the accuracy of weapons and spells, but it basically boils down to who's going to hit harder, faster, and most importantly, who's positioned the best. Combat basically works like this. You get into position, you press space to pause, then you target a bunch of abilities, then you unpause and let auto combat handle itself for a few seconds. Then you pause again, use some more abilities, unpause, auto combat, rinse and repeat. Might sound simple and easy, but for the love of God, it can be tough. Not a lot feels better, though, than finally killing that asshole dragon that's been one-tapping your backline because you positioned them too close. The classes are super dope too. The Cypher, for instance, is a soul mage that channels their soul powers into their weapon. The Chanter, for instance, is Pillar's take on the Bard, using songs and stuff to do a variety of magic, including buffing allies, summoning skeletons, or just dealing a lot of damage. And like a lot of RPGs, your class will affect dialogue, though I would argue that not a lot of games, Baldur's Gate 3 included, do it as in-depth as Pillars does. Pillars gives you so many opportunities to show off how unique and cool your class can be through dialogue. For example, you'll often deal with these soul mages referred to as animancers, and if you're a Cypher, you'll have not just unique interactions and dialogue, but you can influence all kinds of things within the world. Your rogue will have plenty of roguish options for solving quests, and a wizard might have the magical insight to figure out a quest step that you typically have to do a ton of other tasks to complete. This makes replayability a huge factor for this game. On top of your class-affecting dialogue, your race and background do too. From classics like humans and elves to hairy little dudes called Orlons or half-breed godlikes. There are tons of benefits to each race, including the humans, which don't see a lot of love, and even more behind your background and homeland, such as being a bounty hunter from Living Lands giving you bounty hunter dialogue options, or a scientist from Adir giving you scientist dialogue options that really interact with what you're doing. The level of depth your own character really does have makes you feel like you are a part of the world. To summarize, I really feel like no game I've played to date really sinks its claws into me the way Pillars of Eternity did. Its story and world building are phenomenal, and the characters are interesting and unique. The visuals are beautiful and atmospheric, and I really feel like Pillars opened me up to a whole new genre of games that I don't think I would have considered had I not played it. Pillars is the reason I gave Baldur's Gate 3 and eventually D&D a shot. It got me into Fire Emblem and a bunch of other strategy JRPGs. It's short, it's sweet, and you don't need a jet engine for a PC to run it. It's an incredibly interactive, immersive strategy RPG that reframed what I consider a good game. Thanks for watching.